Hello, everybody. This is the Flex Future of Work podcast with Greg Caplan and Eve Mayer. And today we have a fantastic guest that I'm very excited about. She is the Remote Work and Inclusion Program Manager at HubSpot. Please welcome Meaghan Williams. Hi, Meaghan. How's it going?
Hi, it's going well. Thanks for having me, Eve.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. You know, Greg was in charge of our very first important guest here, and he said it had to be you. And so the goal of our podcast is to discuss remote work and flex work from both angles. We want to talk to people who are doing it, and we want to talk to leaders like you, executives who are embracing remote work, understand the trials and tribulations behind it, are helping move people forward. And so we can just really talk honestly about where the gaps are, what people are still fearful of. And Greg said that you are the executive to it. Greg, why was Meaghan like the first person that came to your mind? I want to hear about this.
Yeah, so just to start, Meaghan is one of the humblest thought leaders I've ever met in remote work. And she really understands from managing their implementation of remote work at HubSpot with hundreds of people. So it has one of, I think, the most cutting edge understanding experiences with remote work, but also comes at it very pragmatically, very humbly, and is great to learn from and talk to and explore some of the successes they've been having, and also very honest about the challenges that they've been having when they are present. So I'm super excited to have Meaghan on the pod and really learn from her about her experience as well as HubSpot's experience entirely on what's happened, how they've learned, how they've evolved, and what's been working and where they still have opportunity to continue improving. So without further ado, I want to welcome Meaghan to the pod. Meaghan, do you want to just give a quick summary of your background, how you navigated your career and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words. I'm humbled and honored to be your first guest. Obviously, remote work is my favorite topic, and I'm really excited to be talking about it with you all today. In terms of how I got here, it's kind of an interesting journey. I started my career in higher education and made a pretty big pivot to the tech space about 4 years ago when I joined HubSpot. And when I first joined HubSpot, I started as a customer success manager. So I got to know our product pretty well. I got to know our customers. And in that role, I also leveraged the flexibility HubSpot has to work from home. And so personally, I started to understand how beneficial that was. It was the first time in my career I could do that. And because of that flexibility, I was also able to get my MBA at night. I just was able to commute to my classes. I was able to do my homework. I could balance all of that because I didn't have to worry about getting in and out of the city for work. And so with that graduate degree, I focused on business leadership, organizational transformation. And so I was also learning on the research side how powerful remote work can be. And so between that personal experience, the research I did in my classes, I was just amazed by what remote work can do, yes, for the person, but also for the business, and then that ripple effect it can have on the larger world and the economy. And so when this role was created a year ago, it was like a dream come true, right? I already loved the company of HubSpot. I was fascinated by remote work. I wanted to transition into that space. So I jumped on it. I was honored at the time, and I'm still honored to have this role at HubSpot. And it's been an incredible journey getting to this place.
That's unbelievable.
Thanks so much for that. Can you tell people, I'm very familiar with HubSpot. I owned a marketing company I sold a couple of years ago and was fortunate to work with HubSpot many times. Can you tell people who don't know about HubSpot a little bit about the company and why it even makes sense for you guys to have remote work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So HubSpot is an online platform that helps our customers to market, sell, and service to their customers. And so remote work, we're a global company as well. But what we think about is that our customers are all throughout the world, right? They're coming from all different businesses, all different places, all different perspectives. And one of the beautiful things about remote work is that it also allows us to hire people from all over the place with different perspectives and different backgrounds as well. But it also allows us to think about how do we better serve time zones? How do we make sure that in order to best serve our customers, our employees also have to do their best work? And for a lot of people, that's not 9 to 5 in an office in the city. So remote work just allows us to hire people who can do their best work wherever that may be or whatever that looks like for them.
That's awesome.
Got it.
Very cool. So Meaghan, take us back through history. So HubSpot has a large remote team at this point. Can you take us back to when did remote get started? What was the story then, and how has it evolved to where it is today?
Yeah, so a little history lesson with remote work at HubSpot. We've had remote employees for almost as long as we've been around. And in the beginning, it was very much about knowing that, maybe we had an employee who we absolutely could not lose. We wanted to make something work for them, but life was taking them outside of Cambridge. And so we made remote work in those kind of scenarios. And we had a handful of remote folks from the very beginning, but it was very much sort of organic, as needed, figured it out between the manager and the employee themselves. In the past couple of years, all of a sudden, remote work has become more popular. More and more employees are taking advantage, and we've started to hire net new remote employees and now have grown to a population of nearly 300. And
Wow.
so, in parallel to that, as a company, we're also thinking about, this is a big population for us. And so how do we make sure that somebody is being really thoughtful about remote work and kind of serving as the DRI to make sure that every single division within the company, every single process that you might go through as a remote employee is one that is just absolutely seamless? Are we providing that incredible culture, that incredible experience for our remote employees who might be in a different location and aren't within the walls of our office? And that's really where my role came in a year ago, was to make sure that somebody was 100% focused on that and making sure that as a company we have more of a sort of global perspective and a process aligned to our remote employees.
Very
You know,
cool.
when I
Just
sold,
real quick, before we get into some of the nitty gritty and how you make it successful, I'd love just for the audience to help understand, how does remote work actually look from a population perspective? You said there's 300 people. Are they concentrated on certain teams? Are they all across the organization? How do you sort of think about who those remote folks are and what that actually looks like from just like a statistical perspective before we get into how do you make those people successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have remote employees in nearly every division at HubSpot.
Wow.
I'd say they're most popular probably in marketing, sales, and services, as you can imagine.
Yep.
But they are in almost every division, the exception being we don't tend to have remote security employees because they tend to be, of course, in the building securing us. But other than that, they are prevalent throughout the divisions as well as throughout leadership. So we've got remote VPs, remote directors, remote managers, remote, obviously, individual contributors. But what I think is interesting about HubSpot's remote population is that we actually only have one 100% remote team managed by a remote manager.
Wow.
Everyone else is on a hybrid team. So what that looks like is your manager might be remote, they might not. You might have one remote employee on your team, or you might have 10 remote employees on your team with one in the office. So as a company, we're all constantly thinking about how to be better virtual colleagues, how to be more globally inclusive. And that remote relationship plays out in a lot of different ways.
That's unbelievable. So cool that you have it leadership all the way through in all different teams. How do you think about creating the culture to make that successful in these very diverse hybrid teams? Because that's a very complicated thing that I've seen, that hybrid environment where some people are together, some people are remote. What are the things that you like to do, the most important things culturally, to set the right stage, to make the right environment for those folks to be successful, both the co-located folks and the remote folks culturally?
Yeah, and culture, of course, is a huge thing for HubSpot. It's something we care deeply about, all the way from our culture code, which was created by our co-founder, Dharmesh. And so when you think about culture in a hybrid team, I think the biggest thing is just knowing that you have to be very intentional about it. You have to be thoughtful, sometimes even a little bit creative. And so in terms of, specific strategies, how do we actually do that? I always take it back to three main sort of tenets, if you will. And so the first is it's everybody's job to be remote inclusive. It's not just the remote employee. It's not just their manager. It's not just the people operations team that I work with. It is every single person, whether you're remote or not. And so what that means is that whether you're having a giant event at HubSpot or maybe a very small team meeting, you always need to be thinking about how are we making this work for folks who might not be in this building. And that has really served us well, because I think if everybody's working towards that same shared goal, it feels a lot more organic and it just happens a lot quicker. It scales a lot better.
Definitely.
Yeah. The second thing I think about is we try to start with the assumption that it can be done virtually, right? We might be wrong, but what we think about is in anything we might be doing as a company, how can we transform that to be inclusive of folks, again, who might be joining us from their laptops? And so, one thing I love about HubSpot is that we are a company that is just very willing to be creative and vulnerable and even silly, to make sure that we can be inclusive. So that kind of mindset has led to everything from remote yoga to remote holiday parties. If it's something we'll do in the office, we'll try to do it virtually too. And it's led to some really fun moments along the way. But I think that sort of leads to really the third piece of it, which is making sure that culture is decoupled from location. Just because somebody's sitting outside of the walls of HubSpot doesn't mean that they shouldn't have equal access to or an equal contribution to our culture. That's something that extends beyond the physical location. And if we're constantly as a company thinking about culture, not as the facilities or the place, which are of course incredible, but as something that is living and breathing with every HubSpot employee, that's something that allows us to kind of transform the way we think about it.
That's awesome. I love that. And you talked about a couple interesting things in there, the remote yoga and remote holiday parties. I love getting creative and finding fun ways for people to come together virtually. Those are so exciting. Are there any sort of very specific tactics or strategies that you like to use at HubSpot that you think are innovative or interesting that other people maybe want to think about, that could actually build that engagement for people virtually? Because you have the remote folks, you have the co-located folks. Yoga, I can't even imagine how you do remote yoga.
It was interesting, I'll tell you that much.
No one wants to see my downward dog on a screen.
Yeah, it was definitely a bonding moment for us all. But yeah, I mean, in terms of engagement and specific strategies, so I think one thing, especially in a hybrid team, is that naturally, if there is, let's say, a majority in the office, it's not an equal playing field inherently. If you've got 6 people in a room together and one person zoomed in, it's very hard for that person to feel like they have an equal say, right? Feel like they can naturally jump into the conversation.
Definitely.
And so we do think about certain strategies to help those team members feel more comfortable, especially when the majority might be in the office. So first, what we talk about is building psych safety. And psych safety for us is the idea that within a team, you feel comfortable maybe asking the silly question or opposing an idea, perhaps being the voice of dissent without worrying about what your team is thinking, or without worrying about what your team might say when they walk out of the room and you're still sitting on the computer. And so building that kind of psych safety, it's hard virtually. But what we recommend to people, we have what we call how to work with me docs, which are,
Cool.
yeah, essentially just, it goes through different questions of, here are my quirks. Here's how I like to communicate. Yes, I like to be cold called on Zoom, or actually, please don't cold call me. I'd much prefer that you let me think about it and jump in when I feel comfortable. So we think about that to sort of set the stage for that kind of communication. We also think about virtual team lunches, virtual stand-ups, and making sure that there are systems in place so that we can get to know each other before we even start to think about how do we collaborate, communicate, and think about performance. It all sort of builds off of that psych safety. And then we create a little bit of structure to that communication. So for example, what we encourage in a team Slack room might be, share your failures on a Friday to reinforce this idea that everybody fails and that's okay. It can be very normal for a remote person to feel like they're the only person who maybe made a mistake because all you see on Slack and on email is everybody doing the best work.
Right.
So we try to sort of reinforce that communication and sharing. We encourage teams to ask things like, what's your rosebud and thorn? Something you're looking forward to, something that didn't go so well, and maybe something that did go so well, to encourage more of that communication without just asking that one remote person to constantly sort of announce on Slack what's going on for them. So we try to make it a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more safe.
That's very cool. Go ahead.
So Meaghan, when I used to work in an office with lots of people and I loved it. And then I was in the remote world suddenly, but I didn't have a HubSpot. I didn't have a culture like that. It was me, like, and a couple people. And and I was really lonely. So I'm curious to know, when you have these remote positions and sometimes you bring somebody in who maybe has never been remote before, have you ever experienced where they feel lonely or sad and they don't know how to take advantage of these programs at first? And how do you deal with that? How do you help them?
That's a great question. So I think that happens for a lot of people, particularly people who might start in an office, life takes them elsewhere, and then where they may not have chosen to be remote naturally, all of a sudden they don't want to leave their company and they're remote.
Mm.
And so we do think about how to help with that transition. So whether you start at HubSpot net new as a remote employee, or if you go from the office to remote, we give you resources proactively to help you, one, set expectations with your manager on how will you make sure that you're still communicating, you're still getting that sense of team and camaraderie. Two, we have a lot of ways for our remote folks to connect with each other. So we have
Oh,
a
cool.
weekly remote water cooler, which is essentially a Zoom of drop by, say hi. And it's just an hour to talk about anything but work. There's a lot of dogs that drop by, but it's just a time to kind of connect with other people who get it. So we have that every week. We've got monthly remote mixers where you have the opportunity to be matched with someone else who's remote. And that is nice as well for sort of that cross team collaboration. But we're constantly encouraging all of our teams, again, just because someone's gone remote doesn't mean you can't have lunch with them, doesn't mean you can't have coffee. You just spin up a Zoom and book a room if you're in the office, making sure that, again, back to that idea of it's everyone's job, to make sure that remote employees still feel included, as long as we don't let that barrier of distance prohibit that kind of communication and time together. We can pretty much do anything to make sure that they still feel included and can battle some of that loneliness that they might feel.
That's
Well,
awesome.
I wish I was part of your team because that sounds amazing. So you
It's pretty
guys
fun.
have a set amount of time that you get to get, like, do you have an event each year where everyone sees each other? Is that, do you find that that's necessary, or, and if so, how often is it?
Yeah, so every function handles it a little bit differently, but essentially what we try to do is create some consistency and equality by function. So for example, all of our remote sales employees might have the opportunity to come back to their headquarters 3 or 4 times a year. And we, of course, try to make sure that that happens as much as possible all at the same time so everyone can see each other at the same time. But we also try to be really thoughtful around the idea that some people don't want to travel, aren't able to travel, or travel is very anxiety inducing for them. So we try to also reinforce the fact that if coming back to the office is enjoyable for you, great. We want to enable that and make sure we're making the best of that. If that's not what works for you, that's totally fine too. And so any event we might have in the office, we'll have a Zoom for. We want to make sure that all of our ERGs, for example, are also very much open to our remote employees and comfortable for them to engage in.
That's so cool. I love that. And I think coming together is a great way to build trust, but like you said, it's not always possible for everybody to do that, which is interesting. So I think that's so helpful, understanding how you guys build engagement and trust and camaraderie and teamwork. I want to shift a little bit and talk about work, because that's ultimately what people are doing when they work together. Um, Across the org, the difference in my mind between remote work and co-located work is really communication, right? The way that you communicate with people is just different because it has to be digital. And I just want to understand, across HubSpot, how do you guys think about setting norms and expectations for communication for the co-located people, the hybrid people, the remote people, in order to create that it's everybody's job culture to make remote work work, for the actual work that needs to get done, for meetings, for texting, for email, for, I don't know if you use Slack or what are the norms that you set for the actual work communication to make that kind of thing successful across the org?
Yeah, so I think to some extent it does depend by function, because there are just certain teams that work differently together, or perhaps depending on how many time zones are happening within one team, how collaborative that team needs to be. That's where it tends to get a little bit more detailed and intricate by team.
Yep.
But to your point, Greg, I think the thing that we try to think about with people is that it absolutely has to have a plan. It has to be intentional. We have to have a thought process behind it. And so when someone goes remote, one thing we ask them to do with their manager is making sure that they have a plan in place for, if we're spread across 4 time zones, how do we make sure that we're communicating? Does that mean that we don't have any team meetings unless it's hours that everybody's going to be online?
For
How do we
sure.
communicate with each other in an urgent matter? How do we let each other know that maybe, in the office, if you see someone with their headphones on and their head down, that they're getting stuff done? How do we communicate that to each other if we are virtual from each other? And how do we also communicate that, hey, listen, I saw your Slack. I'm going to look into that, but not right now. So we encourage all of those little aspects of communication. We also think a lot about how to manage those different time zones so that, especially for our remote folks, they don't feel like they have to be online all the time. And so the way in which we do that as a company is we really encourage folks to use the Google Calendar working hours, so that if I don't happen to know that you're in Hawaii and I'm trying to book a meeting with you at 3 a.m. your time, I want it to bounce back to me, right? I don't want to put you in that position to have to tell me that that time's not going to work for you. Then we go back and forth. So we use that to be really respectful. We also use Slack in a really interesting way. So we do ask people to set their Slack snooze hours outside of their working time. Again, that just sends the message that if I want to send something at 9 a.m. to a remote employee in California, I get a message back that says, hey, this person's Slack notifications are snoozed, which tells me they're not going to answer me, and that's okay. But it sets this expectation that it never has to be this really urgent, immediate kind of response. We really encourage asynchronous communication where possible, because that also allows us to communicate with our global teams who are in other offices. So it's a lot of just setting expectations that way, being respectful of work hours, and then within the team, being really thoughtful about how will we make this work with the work that we have to do and the results that we have to produce.
That's awesome. There's two things in there that I want to dig a little deeper into. The first one that you said is you have certain things that you like each team to set up. So like, how do they deal with different time zones? How do they deal with urgent communication versus synchronous communication? Do you have a template that you have each team fill out? How do you sort of structure that unstructured team by team type of communication norm setting? I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, so we have a pretty lengthy document that every manager can go through as soon as they have at least one remote employee. And it basically breaks down communication, team camaraderie, results-based work, even corporate connection, and it asks all of these questions. Obviously, that extends beyond the remote employee and their manager. That also starts to involve the team. So we do have a document that we bring to everyone. And again, what we say is the answers to us don't matter as much as the fact that you're asking the question and everyone knows what the answer is for your team.
100%. That is so cool. Yeah. I would love, is it possible for us to see the template to share with the audience? I think that'd be a cool thing for people to see.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that.
Awesome.
I love how Greg put you in pressure right there. All recording. Can we have your stuff? Just send us your stuff. Great, Greg. I like that.
We're all advocating for remote work. We're trying to make it whatever tools we can share. The other thing, which you said, which I have been honestly personally going through a deep investigation, is asynchronous communication versus synchronous, which I think is like the stepchild of remote work, synchronous versus asynchronous, especially as you move to being distributed across time zones. And I personally have been struggling with that because I love synchronous communication. We're here, we're seeing each other, we're talking in real time, and writing things out is the asynchronous part, right? No one's really sharing videos, some voice notes, but really it's written communication versus video chat or phone calls, things like that. And I've been encouraged by a lot of people that I look to for advice on remote work and org design and things like that. And I'm trying to embrace asynchronous more. And to be honest with you, I struggle with that. I personally like to have these kinds of real-time live conversations with folks because I think it's a little bit more fruitful and you get a little bit more nuance from it. How do you personally, Meaghan, think about synchronous versus asynchronous, and how do you bake that into the way you work with certain people versus others? What kind of tips do you have on that for me?
And just real quick for people like me, I don't know what asynchronous and synchronous, I know what the word means, but that kind of communication, what the heck what is that, Greg?
So just to define synchronous versus asynchronous, synchronous is conversation that's happening live. So it's a phone call, it's a video call. It could be even synchronous chat while you're all where you're talking at the same time over Slack or
Okay.
chat. And asynchronous is communications that are not live. So
Okay.
if I'm going to send you an email or a long note on a status report on something, and then you get that, you ingest that, whatever time you do, and then maybe you have some type of response or feedback that happens whenever it is that you have that happen.
Got it. I would imagine you have to have more of that because of remote work and different time zones. But thank you for bringing it down for me and explaining that. Meaghan, teach us.
Absolutely. So I think it really depends on what, what you're trying to convey. So the way that I handle that personally, to answer your question, I work with a global team. As you can imagine, I'm on our core HR team. We have HR in all the different countries that we're represented in. And so if I have something where I need input from everyone, inevitably I can't get everybody online at the same time. There's just too many time zones, and it's not fair to ask people to talk to me in the middle of the night. So what I'll often do in those scenarios is something, instead of an email where everybody's going to get it and then everybody's going to respond on their own, I'll do something like a Google Doc with very specific mentions. At Greg, what are your thoughts here? You then have the opportunity to suggest or comment as needed, and it becomes this living, breathing doc. But we also try to really set expectations on, here's what I need from you, here's when I need it by, and here's how I expect you to respond, which makes it a little bit easier than the, do you want me to comment directly? Do you want me to shoot you an email? So we try to, again, it's all about being intentional. But I also think that sometimes if I'm just trying to convey an idea and I don't necessarily need input, or I don't need any suggested editing, oftentimes what I'll think about is I'll just record a Zoom or a Loom. There's lots of different ways that I'll say, rather than send you a 5-page email, I'm just going to send you a 5-minute video. And actually, our CPO, Katie Burke, does this every week for our team. So of course, our team of people operations is across the globe. Every Friday morning, she does a Loom to talk about what's going on that week, what our priorities are. She does some really cool shout outs. So one, it's a nice way to see her face and hear her voice and her excitement about what's going on. But two, for somebody that doesn't either have time or doesn't, read a 5-page email and be able to digest all of that information, it's also just a nice way to digest that amount and be able to go into the week knowing exactly what's expected of you. So we try to use all of those different channels as well. It really just depends on what you're expecting back.
That is so interesting. That brings up a huge question around remote work, which is tools. There are so many tools. I feel like I have 67 inboxes on my home screen on my phone, right? Literally, like there's Gmail, there's Slack, there's 100 different Slacks. Loom, you have people commenting you on Google Docs. And I feel like this tool stack is just getting all these features and all these different things. And it's making each of these things a little bit better, but making it so confusing to know what to do where, what tools right for this, and how it all works. And you have a team that's much bigger than ours, which I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of tools that people are just bringing to bear because it's become so easy to just start a new tool. We don't need to go into like what tools do you use and like, because that conversation's gotten a little bit stale and a little bit antiquated. How do you think about that? How do you think about, at the org level, letting people bring tools forward? How do you decide what tools you're going to use for what different things? How do you set the strategy and the groundwork for this proliferation in productivity tools that's happening across every team, every org, and getting crazy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as a company, what we try to do is, for anyone coming in, we try to make sure that the big tools that everybody's going to use, everybody also feels comfortable on. And to be honest, that's an evolving process for us. So for example, something we're thinking about this year is making sure that every new hire understands how we use Zoom at the company. And so it's not just how to spin up a Zoom, it's the fact that at HubSpot, we use video. At HubSpot, we typically mute yourself if you're not the one talking in a big meeting. If it's a one-to-one, you always keep your mute off, right? So it's those best practices so that no matter who you're talking to at the company, you feel comfortable in that conversation the same way that you would know what to do if you walked into a conference room with them. You'd sit down, you'd put your notebook down, you'd make some small talk. So it's creating those best practices for those kinds of communication tools that everybody uses, Gmail and Slack included. And then for team by team, one thing I push to people is don't just find a tool for the sake of finding a tool. If you're creating or you're having, an issue or a roadblock where you can't get the work done that you need to with something that's already available, we have a whole collaboration team at HubSpot that specifically works with us to help us better collaborate. So if they need to talk about, smart whiteboards is a big thing where not super relevant for me. I don't do a lot of whiteboarding, but having smart whiteboards for us was born out of this idea that we had remote employees who needed to whiteboard with their teams in the office and needed to do so seamlessly. So in that scenario, an employee or a team could go to the collaboration team and say, hey, we're really hitting a roadblock. Let's brainstorm on how to make this work. And then if it's relevant for the larger company, then we think about how to extend that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Meaghan, I hope you'll forgive me. This is going to be very complicated, very hard question, because this is one of the hardest parts of remote work in my mind, which is how do you measure if remote work is successful? And it's such a loaded question, and I hate it when people ask it personally, because every time people ask that question, I say, how do you know people that are co-located are successful? What are the tools you're using to do that? It's a ridiculous question to ask, but fundamentally, everyone's always asking this. How do we know? And then you always get this leader within an org who says, I don't believe in it. I think that they're not doing as well. You can't prove that they're more successful as remote workers. And then you have this big issue because you can't really refute that well unless you've been tracking it in a very structured, seamless way for the whole legacy of the program. So I'm sure setting people up to be successful is a huge part of your job, but making the business case, figuring out the right way to track it, understanding what is successful, what isn't with the right metrics is so important. How do you think about that personally, or maybe at HubSpot, tracking success? And like, what are the metrics you guys like to use to think about that?
Yeah, so it is a hard question. I'll agree with you, but it's an important question. And one thing I do push businesses to do is to think about what are the results you're looking for in the first place and to have the data to measure it. So I think there's two pieces of it. One is the work that the remote employees are doing. I think every company needs to be results based. So whether you're in office or remote, what are the results that you're looking for out of that person, regardless of whether they're sitting at their desk or what time they got there or what they're wearing? What do you want them to do at the end of the day? And that should be the same regardless of remote or not. And with those results, then you can start to compare how did remote employees perform versus in-office employees. But in general, are remote employees reaching those results? Is it at a faster rate or a slower rate? Is it more consistent or not? So that's more of the work side of things. Are they actually producing? On the flip side of, is remote work working for the company? Certainly harder to measure, but I think it breaks down into two categories for me as well. So one is the pure data. What are the attrition rates? What are the hiring rates? And how are people hearing about your company? If they're hearing it word of mouth from remote employees, that's a good sign. We also do an employee net promoter score every year. So understanding what's the sentiment amongst those remote employees. I think surveys can get exhausting, but I think they're also important to be able to measure in a consistent way. What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? And I think if you create an environment where employees feel safe to be really honest in those surveys, and will also complete them for you and know that you're actually going to take action on them, you can get a lot of great data from that. And then it's even thinking about career growth, right? What is the percentage of employees that actually stayed past X amount of years, or that moved into another job, or that were promoted? Those are the things that we think about to make sure that, yes, they're happy, they're successful, they're staying with us, and they're telling more people about us. That to me is a sign of a healthy remote workforce. But it's something that at the end of the day, will we ever have all the data points to measure? Probably not, but we can do everything we can to use what we have to keep improving.
Let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture of remote. I would love to get just a slice of insight from you as we look towards the future. The world is quickly changing. Technology is allowing for all this stuff. Culture is really demanding it. The best people are demanding remote work. As you look towards the future, maybe not a year or two out, but 3, 5, 10 years out, what do you think remote looks like across industry as it evolves into the future from the seat you're sitting in?
Yeah, so I think industry-wide, my hope certainly is that a lot more companies are going to become more focused on enabling and supporting remote work versus just allowing it. I think it's not enough to just say, sure, you can work remotely. I think what companies really need to focus on is how are we going to make sure that you're supported in that remote job? How are we going to make sure you can grow your career while you're remote at this company? How will we make sure we can communicate with you as a company and really include you in everything we do? So as an industry, I hope and I think that we're going to move in that direction. I also think that just as the industry evolves, and this is true at HubSpot too, we're always going to have to be learning and adapting. There's going to be new technologies. There's going to be new best practices. There's going to be more and more people going remote with more and more time zones. And so I think it's important to make sure that, at HubSpot, we say always be learning, right? Make sure that the job is never done. It might be great. It might be getting better, but there should always be an effort, just as there would be at your company in the office, to make sure that you're constantly improving, trying new things, adapting and adjusting as needed.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I think that that's right. Meaghan, I know we continue just peppering you with these hard questions, and you are doing an amazing job helping everybody here learn a little bit more. So one last question, which is really two questions. I want to ask for your advice. There are lots of people listening who are either currently working with a remote team or are hoping to one day work with a remote team. So I just would love to ask you your number one biggest piece of advice for managers who are thinking about managing a hybrid remote team. And then the second is your number one piece of advice for individual contributors who are going to be remote or are currently remote to be as successful as possible. So let's start with the first one. What's your number one piece of advice for a manager of a hybrid remote team to be successful?
I think for managers, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is that trust is absolutely paramount to successful remote teams. I think that's true in any team, but I think that the biggest challenge to remote managers is building that trust successfully in a virtual environment. And I think once you get that trust and that psych safety down, as we talked about, that's where communication and collaboration and performance can all fall into place. But if you don't have that trust, your remote employee is not going to feel comfortable telling you, hey, I messed up. They're not going to feel comfortable telling you, hey, I had a bad day, or I need a mental health day, or I have a silly question. They're not going to feel comfortable engaging in a team meeting, growing their career at your company. So trust, it's a big thing and it's a small thing. And I think it's a hard thing for a lot of people, but be intentional about the time you take to get to know the human on the other side of that laptop. If you can really do that well and you can start to build that trust with them, that's where remote work can really take off in that relationship.
Unbelievable. Trust is so huge. So huge.
Yeah.
And then for that individual contributor, that employee who wants to be remote or they're currently remote, what's your number one piece of advice for them to be successful navigating this wild world of remote working?
Yeah. So I think we've talked a lot about communication. And for me, when it comes to remote employees, I think over communicating is so important. And over communicating can look like, if I take my dog for a walk for an hour, on my Slack status, I put, I'm walking my dog right now. So people know what I'm up to and know I'm not going to respond to them. If I'm only communicating and writing with other people at the company, I need to really think about my written communication because, what might sound sarcastic in my head might sound offensive in a written communication.
Definitely.
Also being very clear about what do I need from people that don't know me that well. Again, in a Google Doc, what do I expect from you? When do I expect it? And in what format? So I think over communicating is really key to being able to get the work done that you're doing, to being able to build those relationships and make sure it's really clear that you don't have to be sitting at your computer 24 hours a day. Just communicate what your working hours are, how you're going to be doing your work, and how people should communicate with you. That'll allow you to have a life outside your laptop, which I think is so important. And build on this idea that, one thing I tell remote employees is know your worth too. You are just as important as someone in the office. You are just as important as every single employee. And so know that. If something's not working, if you can't hear someone in a meeting, speak up. Over communicate. Tell them you have every right to hear what they're saying too and to be able to speak back. So I think I'm trying to really encourage remote employees to, not just be that sort of Zoom person behind the veil. Turn your video on, make sure that people hear you, make sure that people know you, because we can learn so much from you. We just need to know how to communicate with you first.
I love it. That is awesome. Very cool. Meaghan, this has been unbelievable. There are so many nuggets in here that I'm so excited to take back myself and bring them onto my team. I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great chatting.
Meaghan is with HubSpot. She is the remote work and inclusion program manager. She has a ridiculous amount of knowledge on remote work, and you can check her out at HubSpot.com. I'd like to thank my co-host, Greg Caplan, who is the CEO of Remote Year. And we'll be back soon, hopefully with a guest. Maybe Meaghan, you can help us out with this. We'd love to hear from somebody who's like, remote work sucks. It's not profitable. It's terrible. We don't believe in it. Greg wants to get in there and like learn from that person and hear their objections and like go for that. So if you know like a really smart person we can hear that from, we'd love to talk to them. We'd love to hear about it. We'd love to hear what keeps them from doing it. And the thing when I talk to executives that I usually hear is, I don't think it's profitable. I don't think the ROI is there. I think it's a problem. I can't see what they're doing. And it's that inability to, it's a lack of faith, right? If I can't see the employee, if I can't believe it without seeing it, then I have a problem. So let us know if you know somebody cool like that. So thanks again to Meaghan Williams from HubSpot. Thank you, Greg. And we'll be back with another podcast soon with Flex Future of Work. Thanks, guys.
And one quick call out. Thank you, Meaghan. If people want to find jobs working remotely at HubSpot, where should they check it out?
HubSpot.com/careers/remote is where you can find more about our remote employee workforce at HubSpot, as well as all the open to remote positions and where we allow those, what kinds of jobs those are. We'd love to talk with you.
Unbelievable. Thank you so much, Meaghan.
Thank you.